solving the $1 trillion disease. So today I'm going to be talking to you about what led me to this topic, the whole food plant-based diet and solving dementia and Alzheimer's. Why brain disease? Then I'm going to give you the evidence to what I believe to be the conclusion, then briefly some solutions, and finally some concluding points. So a whole food plant-based diet, what led me to talk about this? Well, it was year 10, I was watching a BBC documentary, and I was just quite compelled when a 96-year-old comes on the screen and tells his age, and he's got no kind of wrinkles, he's got no health problems, and he still says he walks about. No one helps him to walk about. And I was just really intrigued about how his lifestyle, his diet, maybe could have led to that. And it was only about 2.5 years, don't worry, that was never going to be enough for me to give up koftedes and lamb souvlaki, which if you don't know is a delicacy of the Greek diet, and yogurt as well, I can't give them up. It was only 2 years later that I eventually uncovered the China study and Forks Over Knives, a documentary on Netflix, and various other studies that really helped me make the decision to make the transition to a whole food plant-based diet. Before I go into why I chose to focus this on brain disease, I'd like to first make the distinction that this is not about a vegan diet per se. I think veganism is a useful term, it's a very short term, easier to remember than whole food plant-based, but at the same time, it's not really sufficient. You can live off salt, refined flour and other processed foods and still be classed as a vegan. A whole food plant-based diet is more sufficient and inclusive of that. So, the World Alzheimer's Report of 2015, titled The Global Impact of Dementia, estimated that in 2015, the cost of dementia and Alzheimer's was $818 billion. That was going to rise in 3 years later to $1 trillion, and you can see it's going to keep on rising. 46 million people had the disease then. Now, in 2030, that number is going to be 76 million people. You see, unlike cancer, unlike stroke, unlike coronary heart disease, scientists are really struggling to find a cure and prevent dementia and Alzheimer's. And not only that, this is one of the most expensive, not just economically, but also emotionally, the most expensive disease that people face, that families face in trying to solve. But what if this is not a normal part of aging? What if we can actually prevent it? Well, what does the evidence say? So before I go on to the evidence, before I begin to talk about it, I don't take any credit for this. This is the work of scientists, incredible scientists that gave up their reputation, that got ostracized and excommunicated by scientific institutions because of their institutional links to the companies that relied on processed foods, on plant-based foods. One such being T. Colin Campbell, the author of the China study, essentially a literature review of all the nutrition studies that have been undertaken in the second half of the 20th century. And so I do admire those scientists that stuck with their integrity, because it is those scientists that really drive the most change for society. But here we go. So there are 3 types of brain disease. First, we've got cognitive impairment. Then we have vascular dementia, and then we have Alzheimer's. Let's start with cognitive impairment. This is the slow decline of the brain. So, people think when you get older, you begin to do calculations slow, you begin to forget a few things, but, we think that's inevitable. Well, cognitive impairment is a disease, it is diagnosed, and it is not one to ignore. 1 to 2% of people with cognitive impairment go on to, 1 to 2% of people without cognitive impairment go on to develop dementia. 10 to 12% of people with it go on to develop dementia. That is a 10-fold increase. There is clearly something very significant here. So it is also associated with cardiovascular disease, with stroke, with the onset of type 2 diabetes, and that makes sense since it shares the same risk factors: hypertension, high cholesterol, free radical activity, wreaking havoc in the body. But what if we can prevent this? What if diet can have an impact on this? Well, one study found that higher vitamin E intake reduces the risk of memory loss, which then leads to cognitive impairment. Higher vitamin C also was found to reduce memory loss in another study. For vitamin E and vitamin C are antioxidants only found in plant-based products, exclusively from plant-based nutrition. Another study of 260 elderly people came to the conclusion that a diet with less saturated fat, less cholesterol, found naturally in plant-based foods, in processed foods, and higher in carbohydrates, higher in vitamin C, beta-carotene, vitamin E, the same kind of findings, was advisable for less memory loss. A diet lower in vitamin C was associated with slower cognitive ability, and a diet higher in vitamin B was associated with the opposite. The same findings, different studies. The evidence is clearly pointing to one thing here. So that was about 7 studies, all showing that nutrients found exclusively in plant-based protein can all reduce the risk of memory loss. But what about animal-based protein? Well, one study actually found that instead of just lacking the antioxidants, so just not helping prevent it, Animal protein can actually activate free radical activity. Free radical activity is something that leads to the decline of the brain, the destruction, the deterioration of the mind. And so we're seeing the first links of this divergent force. Animal-based protein goes on to speed up the development of these diseases. Plant-based protein actually prevents it, reverses it. Okay, so let's, by the way, that's the evidence, so I'm not lying. Okay, anyway, so let's go on to the more serious one. Vascular dementia. So you may have heard of this, people just call this dementia. This is caused by silent strokes, small strokes that incapacitate parts of the brain, which eventually leads to severe deterioration of the brain. And so preventing this really overlaps with preventing stroke. Studies have found that if you can prevent heart disease, you can prevent vascular dementia as well. What causes heart disease, what causes stroke? It is simple. It's plaque building up in the arteries, building up in the blood vessels. But I just want to make something very clear. Your genes don't determine your future. If you think, I have a parent, I have a grandparent who developed heart disease that had stroke, I'm also going to develop a stroke. Well, that's just not true. Your environment has a very, very big factor to play in which genes are turned on, which genes are turned off. This was found in a study with Japanese people. Japanese people in Hawaii and in California had a higher incidence of heart disease because of their higher blood cholesterol than those living in Japan. And guess what? Those living in Japan, they were more likely to smoke. There is clearly something very strange going on here in what these people, how these people change their diet. So if you want to reduce the risk of vascular dementia, you want to reduce your risk of stroke. And if you want to do that, you want to reduce your risk of, reduce your consumption of cholesterol and the build-up of cholesterol in and plaque in your blood vessels. And so scientists have found that you want to first, to do that, to reduce your risk of developing this arteriosclerotic like blockages in your blood, in your blood vessels, you want to reduce your trans fats. Trans fats found in junk foods, found naturally in animal-based protein. You want to also reduce saturated fats, once again found in animal-based protein and also in processed foods. And also, to a lesser extent, dietary cholesterol, which is found in animal-derived foods, such as eggs. But hold on a minute. If we just want to reduce cholesterol, why don't we just take statin drugs? Statin drugs seem to do the job well. That's what doctors prescribe. Well, statin drugs have adverse side effects. They have negative symptoms. And studies have found that a plant-based protein reduces cholesterol just as effectively, if not more effectively, than statin drugs with zero negative side effects. In a publication from the famous Framingham study, it was concluded that an extra 3 servings of fruit and veg a day reduces the risk of stroke by 22%. And if you can reduce the risk of stroke, you're reducing your risk of vascular dementia. The health of your arteries and your vessels is undoubtedly linked to what you eat. Okay, and then we've got Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, you may know, is caused by the accumulation of something called beta amyloid. It's a similar concept to the cholesterol plaque that causes strokes and leads to vascular dementia, in that these beta amyloid accumulation leads to the incapacitation of the brain. Studies have linked, so let's bring back the genes here. Studies have linked a gene called apolipoprotein E epsilon 4 allele. I had to practice that a few times. Now think about this gene. This gene, if it comes from your mum, you're 3 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. If it comes from your dad as well as your mum, you're 10 to 15 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. Now just think about that. Do you think it's on both sides of the family? I know it's on both sides of my family, and that's really scary, and it kind of makes you feel quite isolated. There's nothing I can do. I'm just going to develop Alzheimer's when I'm older. Well, that's not true. It was found that native Africans had lower rates of Alzheimer's than African Americans living in Indiana. And if you think, oh, that's just because the African Americans living in Indiana might have lived longer. Well, no, these scientists, they control for them variables. These are like-to-like comparisons. There is clearly something going on in the diets of these people. So studies show that a high cholesterol diet, cholesterol coming in again, a high cholesterol diet increases the risk of Alzheimer's. Another study, a study of 5,000 people, came to the same conclusion, that a diet lower in saturated fat, lower in cholesterol, reduced the risk of Alzheimer's. And this is the last scientific piece of evidence, so if you've had enough, it's coming to an end now. This said that a risk of disease, this study said that a risk of developing Alzheimer's was increased by 3.3 times if your blood folic acid levels were in the lowest third of society. And it was increased by 4.5 times if your blood homocysteine levels were in the highest third. What's folic acid? Folic acid comes from leafy and green vegetables. What's homocysteine? Homocysteine is an amino acid found in animal-based foods. Once again, we see that divergence. So we've found that a diet high in animal protein and low in plant-based protein speeds up the development of these degenerative diseases which we so fear in Western society. That is the slides for vascular dementia. And they are the references for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so I'm not lying here. You can look these up. Okay, so I haven't really focused this talk on, okay, so government have this objective, we need to make people eat more plant-based protein and less animal-based protein. Because I think that is, I haven't focused on the way they can implement that, because I think that is less controversial than the fact that this should be their objective in the first place. The fact that government can change our behaviour is something that's quite widely accepted through nudge theory, through taxes, through subsidies. You know, consumers change their behaviour if something is more expensive in the supermarket. So based on that, based on the evidence, with the conclusion that a diet which is higher in terms of plant-based protein, in terms of plant-based consumption compared to, and reducing animal-based consumption, based on that conclusion, the government can then tax the foods we're saying to reduce and subsidise the foods in the supermarkets that we want to increase. And then nudge consumers to make the correct behaviour, but most importantly, provide the information, the transparent evidence on what the evidence says on why this is the best option for people to make. So just wrapping up now. I've given you a load of evidence of why a plant-based diet is more effective in preventing degenerative diseases than cures, than other means that people suggest, and that reducing animal-based protein is going to be key if you want to reduce your risk of these degenerative diseases. Now, if you're not convinced, that's fine, because I've just touched the surface of the evidence. There is an overwhelming amount of evidence there, and I wouldn't have made the shift personally if I hadn't been convinced and seen the overwhelming amount of evidence. It took a long time to give up, and milk was the last one to go. It took a long time to give up some of those foods. But don't despair. Like, one of the biggest fears is that, okay, this is a very strong case, and the evidence is pointing in that direction, and yes, there's more evidence to be shown, but it is really kind of overwhelming. But what about the food? What about the taste? Why would I sacrifice that? You know, I'm here to enjoy life. Well, what you'll find is that your taste buds actually change. Your taste buds actually adjust over time. If I was faced with a full spinach smoothie, I'd probably throw up the first time I have it. But if I was to have a berry smoothie and then add 1 tablespoon of spinach, and then the next day add 2 tablespoons of spinach, my taste buds begin to change and they begin to adjust, and therefore you begin to enjoy the spinach smoothie. I can tell you that I do actually get enjoyment from the food that I eat now, and that if that transition is slow, I'm not suggesting to go to cold turkey and just give up all animal protein, all dairy-based foods. What I'm saying is try to just increase your consumption of plant-based foods. Look at the evidence. See if you are convinced. See if you are convinced with the evidence and the studies that have been presented. And if you don't have the time to read the China study, if you don't have the time to read How Not to Die, at least go on Netflix, have a look at a documentary called Forks Over Knives. That is Forks Over Knives in terms of changing what you eat instead of cutting your body open and going through the radical cures that scientists have found to try and deal with these diseases. Have a look at that documentary, see what the scientists say, see what the evidence says. These scientists having no vested interest in giving this, so they don't have any business benefit from doing this. See what they say and see if that will convince you. Now, I'm not seeking a stubborn philosophy here. I'm seeking the truth. I'm seeking the truth based on evidence, and that's what science should be. And that is why also I'm quite skeptical of this term veganism, of this idea of this ideology forming where the media is very good at bringing people who get very aggressive and very angry about this matter, that everyone should be vegan. I'm not advocating that. What I am advocating is that we look at the evidence. And as university students in particular who are here to develop your mind, to develop yourself so that you can maximize your potential in the future, I'm sure you're interested in being able to have your health that will enable you to deliver value to society, to go on and develop and do and be fulfilled and do what you were made to be. And so dementia, especially Alzheimer's, brain diseases, that is undoubtedly going to stop you from doing that. It's undoubtedly going to prevent you from maximizing your potential. And if there's a way to prevent it, just as something as simple as changing your diet, then surely that will be something of value. So just look at this, look into it, look at the documentary, maybe ask me questions and really kind of be skeptical and look for the truth. Your future self might just thank you for it. Thank you.